Hello there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Marche, the webinar director here at Advice Chaser. Before we introduce our guest and get started, I do need to do a little bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. Well, we are thrilled to bring you today's educational presentation. Attendees are muted, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the chat box, and the presenter will address those queries before or during the presentation today as appropriate. If we can't get to your question during the event, go ahead and leave your contact information for us in the chat box. We'll make sure someone reaches out to you after today's event. We want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to ask for clarification or expansion of the material. I'd love to introduce you to today's guest. Joe Dominic joined Snyder Financial Group as a wealth advisor in 2017. Joe's experience in the industry started as a financial advisor in 2007. He has worked on large teams throughout his career, focusing on comprehensive financial planning and investment management for individuals, high net worth families, business owners, and institutional clients. Joe is a Washington State native who graduated from the University of Washington in Seattle with a BA in Business Administration at the Michael G. Foster School of Business in 2002. In 2008, Joe earned the designation of Chartered Retirement Planning Counselor from the College for Financial Planning. In 2019, Joe earned the designation of Accredited Portfolio Management Advisor, also from the College for Financial Planning. Joe is a life, disability, variable life, and variable annuity licensed as well. Joe, I'm so excited to have you here as a guest on our webinar today. I know we have a lot of attendees, and hopefully we'll be able to field a lot of questions today. And I'm really excited to have you here, and I'm going to turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Marche. I appreciate that introduction. That's a lot of good stuff, background and all that. But yeah, I've been in the industry for a while and I've seen a lot. And I'll tell you, everybody on the call here, financial planning it's so critical, and especially when you are planning for retirement. So if you're 20 years away, if you're 30 years away, if you're 5 years away, 2 months away, planning is how you get it done. That's really what you have to do. It's the building blocks of trying to figure out, where are you now? Where do you want to be? Where do you need to be? And how do you solve in getting there if you have a gap potentially of funding your retirement? Because retirement's really all about replacing your income. And so it really does start with a plan and putting that in motion and figuring out what you need to do to chip away at it along the journey. So we'll go through a lot of different items today. And I really want to, from a high level perspective, because as I'm sure everybody on the call knows, everything's personalized, everything's unique to your situation. So not having all that information, it's very difficult to have a good roadmap until you really do some due diligence on a situation. So do my very best to kind of put it out there, some good information to think about. So really, when you think about retirement, it really does come down to a few different data inputs, assumptions, assumed variables. Planning in nature encompasses all of the above, but it's all about spending. It really comes down to what you spend now, what are you going to spend in retirement, what's going to change from right now into retirement. So if you've never looked at your budget now, I would really encourage folks to put together a budget. Figure out things if you're 5 years away or 10 years away. What's going to go away? Are you still going to have a mortgage payment? Are you going to have higher medical costs? Are you retiring earlier than Medicare to where maybe you need to pick up your own healthcare plan for a few years? That can be a lot of expenses. And so it's really all about spending and understanding what you're going to need to live on when you do retire versus right now. And so starting with your budget right now is critical. How much does it cost for you right now to live? And then, of course, factors like inflation. We're in a very high inflationary environment. I'm sure we all feel it at this time. I know I feel it. But how does that also impact your spending in retirement or the availability of income in retirement? And then one thing I always like to kind of point back to is the general assumption is that retirees need approximately 70 to 85% of their pre-retirement income. That isn't always necessarily for you or myself. I'm shooting for a higher number, but I still have a runway of planning. I still have a time frame that I'm trying to build my own assets so that I can replace my income to how I want to live comfortably in retirement. So it's always unique to somebody's situation, but I would tell you that the general assumption is about 70 to 85%. That's kind of the bogey or the target, if you will, of replacing your income in retirement. But going back to this, everyone does need an individualized, personalized plan to have a starting point of discovery and figuring out whether or not you do have a gap in funding that retirement. So your retirement readiness. So there's a few things we have to consider here. If you're a few years away, if you're 20 years away, like I mentioned, it's really about setting the stage for when you do turn on income. And there's a lot of factors here. A couple of them being, could you experience bad timing? And bad timing essentially means, what if you were about to retire and the market goes down by 10%, 20%? We're kind of in that environment right now. I mean, the market's down 18 to 20% this year alone, from the S&P 500, the Dow Jones, the NASDAQ's off 30%. So we are in what's called, quote unquote, a bear market at the moment. Is that the right time to retire? Some people, they've already kind of put their line in the sand and said, I'm going to retire anyway, end of the year, no matter what's going on. So part of planning is also having the proper emergency funds or cash available during some of those timeframes. We all run into hiccups in life where we might, need to replace the furnace, or something goes out in our house and we have to replace it. That oftentimes is not a planned event. And so if you have the proper resources designated for those experiences, that's going to help you weather some of those emergencies. And I would even point back also just to the fact that, what if you retire when the market does decide to go south? We need to plan and have a plan in place to make sure that you're not going to have to go in and touch a bunch of your retirement assets if you have another resource like cash available. So that's another thing that you always got to think about. One common notion here is most folks would adhere to about a 3 to 6 months buffer of an emergency funds. Some advisors will say that you need a year. Some advisors say as you're heading into retirement, you need 24 to 36 months. Again, that's a very personalized situation where you have to point back to the plan and look at all the different combination of assets that you do have: 401ks, IRAs, non-retirement accounts, and such. And so that's a very personalized decision. But again, I just want to lay out some of the backbone and some of the high level approach here for planning.
Joe, we had a question on the
Yes,
previous slide. I'm going to pop this up again.
sure.
The question was, when you talked about needing 70 to 85% of the pre-retirement income, are you talking about gross or take home?
I would say gross. So your gross income, right? So if you make, let's say you make $50,000 a year, well, I'd multiply that number by 70 to 85%. I would always shoot for the higher of that range. 85% is a starting point. And this is where different iterations, scenarios of a plan, if you're working with an advisor that employs planning in their services, you can actually come back and run different scenarios, right? Where you can say, hey, I want to shoot for 85%, or, I want to shoot for 100%. How far off am I, or am I on pace to achieve that goal? There's ways to solve for that in planning. I hope that answers that question, Marche.
All right. Let us know if we got a thanks from our viewer. So thank you so much. We'll keep on going.
So expenses is one thing that you have to dial in and figure out. Where are you now? Where do you think you might want to be in a few years or 20 years or what have you? And then, of course, you've got to have the factors of inflation, the assumed variables built in there as well in planning. But what kinds of income sources will you have compared to right now? Right now, you might be working. And the goal is to no longer work. That's what retirement is, right? We're not working anymore. Maybe there's passive income. Maybe there's real estate. Maybe there's some alternative income that you have, part-time work, consulting. You decide to quit your day job, but you're going back and you're doing some part-time work, right? Retirement savings, Social Security, pensions are a big one. There's not a lot of pensions out there any longer, but if you're blessed with a pension, there's a lot of decisions around that as well. And there's a lot of questions that you should be asking well ahead of time from your employer, your HR, the administrator, to understand what are your options for turning on that pension. And we'll get a little bit deeper on pensions here in a few more slides, but understanding the landscape of your income in retirement is especially important. Retirement assets. So when you are in the accumulation phase, your working career, you're putting money into your 401k, you're maybe putting some contributions into a Roth IRA if you're within the income limits of being able to do so for a single tax filer or a married filing with jointly. When you are putting money into your retirement assets, you're in the accumulation phase. Well, someday when you are in retirement, that's why you save that money, is so that you can start distributing that money and supplementing any other available income into retirement. In essence, you're replacing your income someday. That's the whole name of the game. So what type of retirement accounts do you have? And do you understand those retirement accounts? Do you understand the implications of whether or not, if you were to retire younger than 59 and a half, can you start taking money out and avoid a penalty? The government assesses a penalty on some types of accounts if you withdraw them prematurely. Do you have any individual IRAs? Do you have any Roth after tax money that you could use? And what sequence of withdrawals should you put into motion when you do start drawing income? In other words, does it make sense for you to start drawing from your Roth IRA bucket before you draw from your non-retirement monies, which are your taxable buckets? A lot of those questions can't be answered right here on the call because you have to do a very deep dive on all of your available sources of retirement assets. And then you also need to parlay that with a conversation with a CPA, a tax professional, and then work with your advisor to come up with a plan. So there's a lot of moving parts that go around with this whole experience. The other question that I often get is, well, does my asset allocation correspond to my risk tolerance? In other words, are you sleeping well at night during these time frames that we're going through? And you know that you're about to retire end of the year, or maybe in a year, or maybe 2 years. Are you too exposed to the market, or do you even need to be that exposed to the market? That's a question I always want to look into for clients, is to understand, what is your family index rate of return, the growth that you need on the average per year to hit your target, to accomplish your goals in retirement? Some people don't need 8 to 10%. They might only need 4 to 5%. So why would we want to have that much risk? A perfect scenario is taking less risk and getting good returns and accomplishing your goals. That's the right recipe. We need to identify what that recipe is and identify what rate of return that is needed for your plan. And then, are you diversified? Are you putting all your eggs in one basket? Maybe you have a bunch of company stock and it might be 50% of your entire net worth. That could be a problem. It might not be a problem to you, but it could be a problem if the company goes down at the wrong time. So we have to be very careful of being overly concentrated in certain positions and making sure we've got diversification across the board. And that could also correspond to different types of accounts as well. After-tax buckets, pre-tax buckets, the whole gamut. And then, do you need to contribute more than you're currently contributing? Are you taking advantage of the company match that's available potentially at your company? In other words, do you need to take up your contribution to a certain percentage or dollar amount to take advantage of what the company is going to give you if you do so? I see this all the time where somebody might say, Joe, I'm putting in 3%, but my company matches up to 6. If I put in 6, then they'll give me 6 as well, or some combination, right? Or some very strange combination where it's a certain percentage, and then if you do a little bit more, you get 50% of the next 3, and so on and so forth. You need to take advantage of that. And so in the conversation with your advisor and your CPA, if you work with a tax professional, we've got to fine tune the plan to say we're taking advantage of the money that's on the table from our employer while we're in the accumulation phase, because that's going to be a very, very, very good situation for your plan. Social Security. This is a loaded topic. We could spend 5 hours on Social Security in this presentation. What I will say is that there are indeed optimization strategies, and I would say they definitely are applicable more so to spouses, right? To married couples, where I was reviewing this earlier over the last week or so, but I read a little piece that said there's over 9,000 different age claiming combinations and approximately 5,900 spousal benefit combinations available to folks. That's a lot of different combinations. So how do you decipher when you should or shouldn't, or do you wait, or do you pull Social Security at age 62? That's the earliest you can take it. Or do you wait till your full retirement age, which could be 66, could be 67, it could be 66 in 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, or do you wait till 70? You get an 8% increase once you hit your full retirement age every year thereafter up until age 70. So that's a pretty nice rate of return in a guaranteed fund, right? So you can lock in a higher income if you wait till 70, but does it make sense to your plan? There's an emotional side of this as well, because some people, they say, well, Joe, nobody in my family lived over 85 years old. Why wouldn't I just want to take the money? Or maybe it's 80 years old. Because it's an actuarially fair system from age 62 to mortality for a man or a woman in America. It's the same exact payout from age 70 if you wait and delay up until mortality for a man or woman. So you don't beat the system by delaying unless you outlive mortality. So it becomes an emotional decision as well. So there's a lot that goes into the Social Security optimization side of things. But again, that needs to be put into a scenario built into your plan. Multiple scenarios ran. One of them, I was meeting with a household a couple weeks ago, and they're looking at an optimization strategy. And so we ran a scenario at age 62 right away, take it right away. They were concerned about maybe not outliving mortality. And then let's also look at one at full retirement age. And then let's also look at one at age 70. What does it look like end of the day, right? At death per se. Nobody wants to talk about death, but what does it look like at death? Do you leave money to your beneficiaries, or do we even need to worry about waiting till age 70? Because you might be so far ahead using conservative variables in your planning that you're fine. There's really no question about it, right? I mean, obviously something could go sideways, but when you look at a cash flow versus a Monte Carlo summary, I'll get into that a little bit later as well. But when you stress test scenarios and you have a high probability of success, maybe the decision is a lot easier than you think. Or maybe you really do need that income right away at age 62 or 66 or 67, because guess what? You're gonna plow through all your investment assets if you don't turn that income on. That's another thing to consider. So you can probably already kind of see how this is really, it's a deeper dive than a lot of people think, that there are a lot of opportunities to try to optimize situations for planning. Pensions is another big one. Again, if you're blessed with a pension, my hat's off to you. That's great, right? Pensions aren't really around as much anymore. That changed many years ago, where some companies offer pensions. That's great. But there's a lot of decisions, again, optimization strategies that we just spoke of. What I would tell you is that if you're doing financial planning, you should always use conservative variables. You shouldn't run plans at 10% growth rates. You should probably chop that in half and use about 4.5 to 5. That's how we do things at our firm. But I will tell you is that around the pension decision, there's a lot of noise right now. You've probably heard this if you do have a pension at your place of work, but segment rates are getting battered around right now. Segment rates are really, they help and determine what your value of your lump sum option, if you have one, is compared to what a lifetime income stream may be if you choose to turn on income for the rest of your life. Well, you may be in a better position to take the lump sum, again, using conservative variables in the planning. Then you may be taking the lifetime income stream. There's a few other factors to consider as well, is that if you and your spouse pass away and your spouse is the beneficiary, more than likely in your plan documents, that pension goes away. It's gone. And so you don't leave a death benefit to your children or charity or wherever else you want to leave a beneficiary or income for. That would just go away. So there's a lot of decisions that go on behind the scenes of making that decision on whether or not you should turn on the income for the rest of your life or take the pension lump sum and essentially put it into an IRA and have it managed, and turning on your own income stream over time, adhering to the principles of, the methodology of withdrawals, if you will, appropriate to an age. So there's a lot of information there packed into that slide, but I would just very much consider looking into the fine details of whether or not it might make sense for a lump sum versus a pension.
All right. Well, we do have a question about
Yeah.
that, but I'm just going to go ahead and let you move on, and we'll bring it up during our question and answer session. So I don't
Absolutely.
want to get too much into the weeds before we cover the overview here.
Perfect. So going back to expenses, which I think it's a real big piece of planning for retirement, obviously, but what kinds of expenses will you have? And there's at the very bottom, I'll skip down to the bottom, but there are some expense blind spots that people often overlook in planning. One of them could be healthcare. I will tell you right now, that's one of the wild cards in planning that I always see: healthcare and a few other items that I'll get to. But when you talk about expenses in retirement, what will those look like? Are you going to have housing costs? Did you pay off your mortgage? What is your food going to look like? Are you going to go out to restaurants as much? Are you going to go out to restaurants more? Transportation costs. Are you going to eventually, you're probably not going to want to be driving an automobile, right? So you probably have to have transportation costs built in as well. Utilities, clothing. I mentioned medical and healthcare. If you retire earlier than 65, which is when Medicare begins, it doesn't begin at age 60 or 55. I meet with a lot of younger folks that say, hey, I want to retire at 50, Joe. I say, okay, great. What are you going to do for healthcare? Because it doesn't start until 65. So we need to pack that into a plan as well, using very, very high cost of living adjustments on healthcare. That's one of the wild cards. It's not 2.5% average inflation. It's more like 5 to 6% growth on that cost in retirement. So, and even here's the other one, even medical costs in retirement, when you do have Medicare, there are costs associated with that too. And I'll get into that on another slide, but really fine tuning your budget to understand, what do I pay for now? What am I going to pay for later? What is going to go away later? And maybe what comes in later. Good example is restaurants, like I mentioned, right? I mean, in retirement, you may want to go out and frequent restaurants a lot more because you're not going to be working as much. And so there's a lot of vacations, right? Maybe you want to have a budget of $5,000 a year, $10,000 a year just for vacations. That should be a line item in your plan, not just lumped into your average living expenses per month. We should be very, very granular on some of those other expenses in planning. I touched on this a little bit, but healthcare. I will tell you, when I do financial planning for our clients, I use a very high number for healthcare costs, even with Medicare, because there's things called Medicare supplemental plans. There's actually a cost to Medicare as well. Medicare does not pay for your vision, your dental. You've got to go out and buy a Medicare supplemental plan, a lot of prescription drugs. There's a lot of things about Medicare that people think it all gets paid for, but then when they are actually on Medicare, they realize I'm still coming out of pocket. And so in the plans that I run, and a lot of studies will indicate this, there's studies done by many institutions. I won't get into the fine details of that. I'll just tell you the average of all these studies is about $6,000 per individual starting at age 65. All the way through the rest of your life with a 6% inflation rate. And so when I do planning, I actually start using that number today, and I inflate that from today all the way through, because that's the right way to do planning. You don't just start inflating it when you turn 65. If you're 55 right now, we have to look at what that cost might be when you get to 65 and then continue to inflate that cost. And so that's where you can get very granular if you have the right systems to use for planning, not just the old archaic where you answer 10 questions and it spits out a probability number. You need to be very deep dive into the planning. So healthcare can be a wild card. That's something that you have to build into your planning for what those expenses might look like on the growth trajectory that they could be in retirement.
Yeah, a question here. Does
Yes.
this also include long-term care uh, issues as well in this healthcare idea?
Yeah, I would say that's a great question. That's actually on a future slide here that we're coming up upon. But I would say long-term care is another very big topic for planning, especially if you're younger and you might have the means or the availability to go out and purchase a long-term care policy. It might not be right for everybody. Some people can self-fund a long-term care event, or you might have it, in your back pocket. I'm just going to sell the house and downsize if I have to go into a facility. There's a lot of things you could do potentially with different assets and availability of different resources, if you will. But I would tell you that if you can catch it early and you can say, hey, maybe I ought to consider buying a long-term care policy if you can afford it, right? That would also be part of that whole discussion for planning for retirement. But again, it's going to be difficult if you're 1 or 2 years away from retirement. It's going to be very expensive. I'll just tell you right now, it's going to be expensive if you're 60 years old looking to go and buy a long-term care policy. But I think it's something that you got to look into. You got to look into what could that cost look like. A good advisory firm that employs a financial planning process covers these scenarios. They look under the hood. They say, what if one of you, if you're a married couple, experiences a long-term care event when you're 75 years old, for example? What does that do to your plan? And then putting in that kind of information with the cost of living adjustments, the inflation factor on long-term care, because again, it's not 2%. It's much, much higher. We all know that medical and healthcare costs, they rise considerably every year. It's not just pennies, it's big dollars. And so that needs to be built into a plan to make sure that we are actually showcasing the right scenario. Great question, though. Long-term care planning is definitely something that you want to look into.
All right, moving on here.
Your mortgage. So when I get a lot of questions about this and I do a lot of scenario analysis on whether or not somebody should consider, and I think we all want to try to relieve ourselves of any debt burden by the finish line, right? You don't want to walk. A lot of publications, a lot of institutions will suggest you got to pay off your mortgage. Well, I would beg to differ in some scenarios. Maybe not yours, but in some scenarios, there's a reason sometimes to not always try to make the extra $500 payment a month or $200 or $100, because I met with a couple months ago, actually, and they were considering, I have to pay off my mortgage by the time I retire. They want to retire in a couple of years. Well, guess what they're putting in their 401k? 2% each. They're funding their 401k with 2%, but they're making extra payments to a very large degree on their mortgage payment where they have a shortfall. They have a gap in funding their retirement. Does it really make sense to try to pay off that debt when their accumulation is far behind where they need to be at retirement? Conclusion is that they're probably going to have to work a little bit longer. They're probably going to have to save a little bit more. They're probably going to have to dial their expenses in a little bit for retirement if they want to make their goal of retiring over the next couple of years happen. So that whole goal of trying to pay off your mortgage, it might not make as much sense as people think. You might consider cash flowing it in retirement for a few extra years. Again, this is only if the plan will actually allow for that using conservative variables. But that's a very difficult decision to do just on a whim. You've got to do some planning behind the scenes of figuring out, does it make sense for me to try to blast through this debt before retirement? Or maybe I just let it go for a few years into retirement. What is the alternative that you could have saved more by not trying to pay off the debt? Power of compounding, growth rates, it's not easy to talk about right now because the market's down. But over time, if you get an average that might be ahead of what your mortgage rate is, if you locked in a low rate recently over the last couple of years, now they've doubled over the last year. But what if you got in at a good mortgage rate and you average 5%, but your mortgage rate is 3 or 4? Well, you just won by saving more money, right? Because you're saving more money and you're getting a better rate of return. So it's a very, you got to do a deep dive in planning to figure out, does it make sense for you to consider paying off your mortgage? The other one is, are you going to downsize? A lot of retirees are thinking, well, the kids are out of the house. I don't need 4 bedrooms anymore, 3 bedrooms. I just need 1 or 2. That's it. I think I might take a little bit of my profit on my home and go and downsize and then put some of that money back into savings. And that might also support a more acceptable or comfortable retirement. So again, this is where scenario analysis comes into play, where you run multiple scenarios versus your base scenario where you are right now. Tax planning is critical. I think being in the industry now for 15 years, I'll tell you, the people that really get things dialed in as they're planning for retirement do employ or at least hire out a CPA. And I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to do that, but I will tell you that if you have proactive collaboration between your advisor and your CPA, a lot more things get done and you take advantage of a lot more opportunities during the year, not just getting your taxes done at the end of the year. But tax planning can be very critical. We could talk about this for 3 hours. And one of the things that I'll tell you is that when you think about the type of account to take money out of in your distribution phase, no longer working, now you're taking money out, there is a proper methodology to do so. In other words, would I point my clients to say, you ought to start taking money out of your Roth IRA right when you turn 65 and you're retiring? Probably not. I know I won't, because I want to leave that after-tax bucket for the end, because it really doesn't make sense to use that Roth IRA right away, because you're probably going to be in a lower tax bracket as well for your pre-tax money. And then if you have proper non-retirement accounts as well. But sequence of withdrawals is a big deal. And so how do you do that? Well, again, it goes back to planning, but it also is the collaboration between an advisor managing your assets, running plans, and then also speaking to a CPA that can run different projections. And here's a big concept. It's called bracket creep. It happens a lot with folks that are in retirement where they say, well, Joe, I want to take all my money out of my non-retirement account to start, and then I'll filter into taking money out of my IRA or my 401k, or I'll just wait until age 72 when I have required minimum distributions. The government forces me to take money out. Well, it might not make sense. It may make more sense for you to take a little bit out of your IRA to start. And again, this is when your CPA is involved as well to run different scenarios with your advisor, because then you can do what's called withholding, where you're not at the end of the year with sticker shock going, I owe a lot of money on taxes because I didn't ever plan to save to pay some of those taxes along the way. Well, you can do a little withholding along the way as well. So some clients, they take out a little bit from their IRA, maybe just a little bit, do a lot of withholding. So they pay their taxes up front, and then they plan around taking some more money from their non-qualified account. So that's also a very big deal. RMDs, by the way, everybody, that changed. It went from 70 and a half to age 72. So if you have not started RMDs, in other words, you're not over 70 and a half, retired, then you get to wait until age 72. That's the government forcing you to take money out of those pre-tax accounts. Doesn't apply to Roth IRAs or Roth accounts, but they're forcing you to take money out so that they get their tax revenue, because you have not paid taxes on that money all the way through your accumulation phase. Other retirement considerations. So I meet with a lot of business owners. Business exit planning is a really big deal. Do they want to invite their family members in, their children in, to be maybe the new owners of a business? There's a lot of different opportunities for that. Or do they want to sell the business, have an exit strategy, right? And then what do they do with those funds when they're and how can we help them avoid some taxes to some degree as well? Or just the planning to eventually exit the business. There's a lot of plan that goes on behind that. Life insurance, of course, we need to look at life insurance. It's going to become a lot more costly as you get older, obviously. So the younger you are, looking at either buying a term policy or a whole life, a universal policy. There's a lot of different types of policies. That's, again, a planning element we have to look at. How much do you need if one of you, if a spouse passes away? Estate planning, there's a lot of techniques. I like to build into my plans for clients are gifting strategies. How much do you want to leave your kids? There's a limit every year. You can gift out $16,000 to anybody before you have to file any gift tax returns. Married folks can gift out $32,000, $16,000 times 2. That's called gift splitting. And so there's a lot of opportunity to parlay the gifting also in a plan, but we got to make sure that you can fend for yourself through your life as well. So that's where proper and prudent planning comes into play. HSAs, health savings accounts, those are definitely things that you should consider if you can afford them throughout the year. And then it all comes back to, well, what is the construct of that at your employer as well? Required minimum distributions we talked about. And then annuities. Annuities are, again, there's a 3-hour conversation. Annuities can get very, very complex. One thing I will say about annuities, is you gotta understand them. You have to make sure a good advisor would explain an annuity to the nth degree before you ever even consider an annuity, because they can get very, very difficult to understand, and there's so many different types. And whether or not it even makes sense for you to have an annuity, again, that's a very deep dive on a planning conversation to where we could say, does it even make sense? Do you need an annuity? Is that something you really want? And what are the features and the benefits of those annuities? Can you leave a death benefit to your beneficiary someday? Or does it go down 1 for 1 every time you take a dollar out? Is there a component built in for growth potentially over time? There's a lot of factors that go into whether or not you should ever consider an annuity, but they're right for some people, they're not right for others.
All right, I know we're getting close to our wrapping things up. I just wanted to let people know I am gathering your questions, and we will have a question and answer portion at the end. We got some questions about pensions a little bit, and some questions about running scenarios. So we're looking forward to talking about those. And I just wanted to let Joe go ahead and finish up, and then we'll go ahead and answer those questions, folks.
Yeah, and I'll wrap it up with these next few slides. I think these are very critical, very important to understand. But I started talking about identifying whether or not you have a gap in the funding of your retirement goal. And what I mean by that is, again, going back to income and expenses. Do you have enough income in retirement to accommodate all the expenses that you have earmarked, right? Any expenses like vacation funding, or even carrying a piece of debt into retirement, or your living expenses, your water, sewer, garbage, restaurants, gas, the whole gamut. Do you have a gap in funding those goals in retirement? Because if you do, and if you have time to try to close that gap, that's a beautiful story. If you don't, well, then we have to figure out exactly what you can do or what you can afford to do. Many variables are going to go into finding what that gap is and what might be used to close the gap. What I'll tell you is proper planning. When you're identifying a gap, you have to use conservative variables. And what I mean by that are rates of inflation, rates of return, growth rates, wage growth. You don't want to just paint a rosy picture. I think any advisor that uses 8 to 10% growth rates on their planning scenarios is missing the whole point of this, because you've got to stress test things to say, well, what if you only get 4%, 5%? We determine that together. We determine that together as far as what assumed variables to use at the onset of planning. But you don't want to just paint a rosy picture. You will want the picture to paint itself so that you truly, truly understand, do I have a gap? Do I have a gap in funding my retirement? Advisors do have planning software. They should, to run these scenarios, highlight, make recommendations, create that financial plan. And then there's another element of planning. You have a cash flow simulation that is built upon those assumed variables that the advisor and the client agree upon, rates of return, rates of inflation. Then there's another side. It's called probabilistic estimation. It's called Monte Carlo simulation. Monte Carlo simulation puts together around 1,000 iterations of your plan, goods, the bads, the in-betweens, 1,000 iterations. The computer does it. So not only can advisors show a plan, a cash flow scenario using their own assumed variables, but then the computer will come up with another 1,000 or so iterations and say, what is your probability of dying with at least $1 remaining? In other words, did you achieve your goals? I always look for 75 to 80, really more like 80%. 75, 80% is where I kind of want my clients to be. Higher the better. If your probabilistic number is 85%, 100%, you're probably pretty good for satisfying your goals in retirement. If it's less than that, if it's 30%, 40%, we have another conversation. This might not be a good situation where you are. We have to identify that and then build upon it and figure out how we're going to close that gap. And then lastly, ways to address the income gaps. It sounds really corny, but think about this. If you have a gap, there's only a few ways to solve it. You either work longer, you save more, or you spend less in retirement. That's really what it comes down to, or a combination, right? If I'm meeting with a client and I figure out they have a gap. Well, the only things we can really do is if you can save more, save more. Maybe you don't make the extra mortgage payments for the next 5 years and you really load up your 401k savings and everything else. Or you consider working a little bit longer. Maybe one of the spouses says, I'm going to work for 2 more years. We're going to save 20% in our 401k. And let's see what that looks like in a plan. Or you spend less. You decide, hey, I can't take $20,000 vacations in retirement. Maybe I can only do 5. Right? Or maybe I'm only going to do that for the first 15 years because then at that point, I won't even be able to enjoy them as much anymore anyway. But finding that solution, identifying the gap, figuring out how to solve the gap. The other one is, hey, what if you get a windfall inheritance or you win the lotto? I don't see that a lot. Sometimes I do. I don't like to build in inheritance dollars into that unless we're pretty sure. Those can be variables that you got to be careful of just packing into a plan because it might paint a really rosy picture and then something happens, you don't get it, right? But an advisor can help you navigate this whole entire experience. And it's the advisors that use that methodology of, hey, we got to do this very conservatively, but we have to identify where you are clearly in a base plan and build off of it. One size fits all doesn't work for financial planning. Everything that I just talked about today was pretty high level. But one thing, I don't guarantee a lot, but I guarantee when I meet with a client, everybody's situation is different. Every single situation. So there's really no cookie cutter approach. Every plan has to be personalized, tailored, unique to your situation as a family, not the person that the advisor met with 2 days ago. It's about that unique situation, all the ingredients, all the assumed variables. And then really your advisor needs to do a very deep dive into your life, your goals, and your financial capabilities. That's how you put together a rock solid plan. And that's how you get to making the changes necessary to fulfill your goals. Kind of parlaying on what I just mentioned, but financial planning really does help you reach your goals. I would just say that if you've never done a plan with an advisor, it's a good place to start. Getting that base fact plan in place, then you can adapt it over the years. Every time I do a plan, I mention one thing. This is a living, breathing document. The moment that you walk out the door, asset values are going to change, right? You do a plan at 12 p.m., the market closes at 1, the plan's already out of date, right? And so things are always going to change. Life events are going to happen. New goals are going to come in. Hey, Joe, I thought I was going to buy the car for 10,000. It ended up being 30. Okay, we should probably put that in the plan. Update all the values because that just exited more money from the plan, right? So things are always going to change, but it really does help you form concrete goals. And it adds a layer of accountability as well. So when an advisor stands next to you and says, here's your plan, let's update it. Hey, you said you were going to go up to 10% in your 401k. You're still at 2. What's going on, right? What's going on with your spending? What's going on with your income? What's going on in your financial life? And then you adapt the plan over time.
All right. Well, I appreciate your presentation today. We're going to go ahead and open up the floor for questions now. So I have gathered some questions here and I'll get started on those to our attendees. If you have more questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. We're happy to address as many as we can in the time we have remaining. We got a question in about pensions. Can you talk a little bit about why someone would take the lifetime income stream as opposed to lump sum? Maybe just give an example.
Yeah, that's really, there's a whole bunch of different points of consideration for taking a lump sum, the dollars, right? So let's just say it's $200,000, or you can take $500. I'm just giving an example, $500 a month, right? That's an example, or $1,000 a month, 750,000 lump sum. So when you think about this, you have to understand that there are implications with pensions. I can't speak for all of them, and I'm not going to try, but I will say some companies in the underlying plan documents, it may say you have one beneficiary you can put on this pension. Usually it's your spouse, right? In fact, your spouse has to sign off if you have any in the state of Washington specifically, whether or not you choose somebody other than your spouse. So let's say you choose your spouse. Let's say both of you are on a trip away, plane goes down, something catastrophic happens. Pension's gone at that point. There's no death benefit after that. If you lock in your pension versus a lump sum, and I'm not trying to tell somebody what to do right now. Again, that's personalized. It's very unique to your situation, but it's a point of consideration that I know I would make if I was blessed with a pension. I would want to know, okay, so if I take this lump sum, I can put on beneficiaries. I could move it into an IRA, have it conservatively managed throughout the rest of my work or retirement life. And then I can work with my advisor and figure out how much I want to take out every year outside of the RMDs that come out at age 72. You essentially develop your own pension per se. It's just not guaranteed to run the rest of your life. That's the other point of consideration. If you're somebody that says, I don't want to play games with that, I just want a guaranteed income for the rest of my life. And hey, if my kids don't get the money because my wife and I are passed away, whatever. You can always set it up for spousal benefits as well. If you die, you could say 100%, it's going to be a less amount of income, or 50%, it might be a little bit more to your spouse. But I would just, or sorry, to start, it might be a little bit more to both of you. And then once you die, your spouse will get 50% of it, or 25, or whatever the combination is, whatever your choices are. But I think that definitely that is part of that decision. You've got to be very careful of understanding what happens at death. What happens with the income? Does it go to my spouse? And then what happens if he or she dies? Does it go to anybody else? 99% of the time, it's going to be probably almost 100. It's going to be no. It does not go further than your spouse. And so that's something that I would just be very careful with that decision, because once you lock it in, you can't go back and say, give me the lump sum now. And so working with your advisor to figure out how much guaranteed income do you need, or even do you need the guaranteed income outside of Social Security? That's a very unique to your own personal situation. I hope that answers that question. There's a lot that goes into the pension decision.
All right. Well, it's good to have an example, and it's also good to know that it is a more in-depth conversation than perhaps we can address right here.
Right.
Here's another question. I've heard that saving about 15% of your income towards retirement should take care of you. Can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe back at the envelope percentage.
Yeah, I love that. So yes, 15% would be I would call that's a good starting point in a normal situation. And what I mean by that is that if you're a household, you're married, right? My wife and I, we try to definitely at a minimum try to save 15% per year. That's what we're trying to do. Maybe we can do more. Maybe we have to do less, but that's kind of the target. And I think a lot of financial pundits and gurus out there, I won't name names, but you hear about them and they'll suggest the same thing. Try to shoot for 15% of your household income in saving for retirement. But that's not always the fix all for everybody. In other words, what if you never saved 15% for 15 years? Now you're 45, 50 years old. Again, this is where we identify the gaps. Maybe 15% doesn't get you home. Maybe you need to up the ante a little bit and say, well, now I got to save. I got to max out my 401k. I got to do whatever I got to do to try to save a little more than that. But that's going to be a number. I would just say that's a very good starting point for folks when they just start out in their careers and they're trying to figure out, what do I do? Do I do 10%, 15%? I would say household wise, you definitely want to start with somewhere near 15%. That's what I would personally recommend to folks, is somewhere around 15%, or try to max out over time. Try to incrementally achieve more savings rates over time. That's a great question.
That is a great question. This is a really good one. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to meet with a financial advisor the first time?
Right.
I'm nervous and kind of scared about that.
I get that all the time. I will tell you what it should be and what it really does look like. What I would say is that it should be a conversation. It should be a yellow pad sitting in front of the advisor, taking copious notes on your life, not theirs. It should be about you. It should be about, what are your goals? What's the landscape of your financial life? What do you want to achieve over the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Legacy goals. What are the assets you have? What are the liabilities you have? What are the expenses you have? All those things we just covered, right? It should be, the advisor should be so involved in listening to the person in front of them. That's what it should all be about. Advisors can tell their story a million times over, right? Here's who we are, here's what we do. But it really comes down to, could you trust that person that you're sitting in front of with your planning, with your asset management, potentially, with some of the different iterations of those plans? It should really be you shouldn't have the threatening type of an experience. It should be more of a just open, let's just get everything out on the table. Here's what I'm concerned about. Here's what I want to try to get accomplished. And then over time, so over in the next few meetings, should come recommendations, but not until the advisor truly understands your situation and does some due diligence, maybe does some different planning behind the scenes, right? At a very, I'd say, high level to start, just to figure out where you are, but then continuing to evolve that relationship potentially to where you might end up working with each other.
All right, and I have time for a couple more questions. I think this is a really good one. And again, a lot of these could probably take up a whole nother webinar, but I do
Yeah.
want to address these. So this one is, oh, here it is. I'm sorry, I lost my place in it.
That's
This
okay.
seems like a lot of work for an advisor. How are advisors compensated to make financial plans? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I'm going to try. Well, I'll just tell you. So advisors, we've all heard of this word called fiduciary, right? Fiduciary. And our firm is a fiduciary. We do not do any, we're not compensated by commission. We don't employ a strategy where we're part of a firm that owns products. I won't name names, but you know firms that own their own products. That's not fiduciary because there's a conflict of interest, because that's what happens at those firms. But I will tell you is that when you're looking at an advisory relationship, you got to understand in a transparent fashion, how is that advisor compensated? Is it a fee-based relationship? What I'll tell you is the fiduciary standards would dictate that you can't earn commission. I couldn't put an annuity in front of you and say, here, buy this annuity. And on the back end, I'm earning a huge commission from finding the right annuity for you, probably the one that pays more, right? That's how that whole conflict of interest comes in. So a fiduciary will have a percentage of assets under management approach. And so in other words, all the planning, all the analysis, all the investment management, they get compensated by a percentage of what they manage for you. But a lot of different advisory firms do it differently. Some charge by a tiered basis, where maybe they're getting their percentage of assets is a little more for the smaller amounts and a little bit more for the next amounts and a little bit more for the next amounts, or a little bit less, I should say. We're a flat tiered system. It's not a tiered system. Sorry, it's just a flat fee wherever it is on the grid. But you want to be careful about the compensation structure and just understanding right away, how is an advisory firm earning their compensation, and what's it going to cost me to do a plan? What's it going to cost me to have assets managed? And so I could go much more granular on how we are set up, but that's something you want to be critical of.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and ask one more question here, and then we're going to close this out. Again, to our attendees, if we haven't had a chance to get to your question, I will be saving this chat and we'll reach out to you to make sure that gets addressed. How often do you have to check in on your plan and on your investments once it's set up?
Ooh, love that question. I would say as life events change, milestone moments. Hey, Joe, I'm going to be retiring 6 months earlier than I thought, 2 years earlier than I thought. Maybe I'll push this out for 3 more years. When life events change, hey, daughter's going to an Ivy League school instead of going to a community college. What does that do to my plan? Those are life events, key moments in time that you've got to update the plan. For our clients, we have at least a once a year meeting. I would prefer, outside of COVID, obviously, to have it face to face. COVID threw us a curveball. A lot of it was Zoom meetings and Microsoft Team meetings and all that, right? But I'll tell you, where we are now is you've got to have a face-to-face meeting with your advisor. At least I would encourage folks to do that. But then there are also checkpoints. What's the cadence of communication and updating that plan? In other words, are we meeting every quarter, semi-annually? Do you feel comfortable enough to calling your advisor and saying, I've got some changes coming down the pike, I need to communicate to those with you? That's the relationship that you should have with your advisors, that trust, that factor of, I need to update my plan because I want to know where I'm at in relation to my goals. And so I would just say as necessary or during milestone moments, but at least once a year annually, or as often as necessary.
A great question there.
Yes, very good.
Well, folks, that's all the time we have for questions. On behalf of Advice Chaser, we want to thank our speaker and the organizations that have worked with us to bring in this webinar today. Thank you so much for attending. Look for an email soon with a link to the replay of this event, and you're welcome to share that replay with your friends and family. Here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who's a great fit for your life and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and each of our advisor partners has committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. Well, once again from Advice Chaser, thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you at another webinar soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.